Raising cattle produces more greenhouse gases than all cars, trucks, trains, boats, planes combined. 13% compared to 18% for livestock. This is because cows produce a substantial amount of methane from their digestive process. Methane gas from livestock is 25 to 100 times more destructive than carbon dioxide from vehicles. The UN, along with other agencies, reported that not only did livestock play a major role in global warming, it is also the leading cause of resource consumption and environmental degradation destroying the planet today. I found out that 1/4 pound hamburger requires over 660 gallons of water to produce. Here I've been taking these short showers trying to save water, and to find out just eating one hamburger is the equivalent of showering 2 entire months. So much attention is given to lowering our home water use, yet domestic water use is only 5% of what is consumed in the U.S. versus 55% for animal agriculture. That's because it takes upwards of 2,500 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. Clearly, the government did not want to talk about this issue. Their inability to answer, along with the environmental organization's silence on the topic of animal agriculture, made it seem something more was going on. I started doing more investigating on the impacts of livestock and found out this situation was actually worse than I had thought. In 2009, 2 advisors from the World Bank released an analysis on human-induced greenhouse gases, finding that animal agriculture was responsible not for 18% as the UN stated, but was actually 51% of all greenhouse gases. 51%. Yet all we hear about is burning fossil fuels. This devastating figure is due to clear-cutting rainforests for grazing, respiration, and all the waste animals produce. This makes animal agriculture the #1 contributor to human-caused climate change. But not only that, I found out raising animals for food consumes 1/3 of all the planet's fresh water, occupies up to 45% of the Earth's land, is responsible for up to 91% of Amazon destruction, is a leading cause of species extinction, ocean dead zones, and habitat destruction.
Free-living animals made up, 10,000 years ago, made up 99% of the biomass. And human beings, we only made up 1% of the biomass. Today, only 10,000 years later, which is really just a fraction of time, we human beings and the animals that we own as property make up 98% of the biomass, and wild free-living animals make up only 2%. We've basically completely stolen the world, the earth, from free-living animals to use for ourselves and our cows and pigs and chickens and factory farmed fish, and the oceans have been even more devastated.
Concerned researchers of the loss of species agree that the primary cause of loss of species on our Earth that we're witnessing is due to overgrazing and habitat loss from livestock production on land and by overfishing, which I call fishing, in our oceans.
And we're in the middle of the largest mass extinction of species in 65 million years. The rainforest is being cut down at the rate of an acre per second. And the driving force behind all of this is animal agriculture, cutting down the forest to graze animals and to grow soybeans. Genetically engineered soybeans to feed to the cows and pigs and chickens and factory farmed fish.
91% of the loss of rainforest in the Amazon area thus far to date, 91% that's been destroyed is due to raising livestock.
The leading cause of environmental destruction is animal agriculture.
I just couldn't understand why the world's largest environmental organizations were not addressing this when their entire mission is to help protect the environment.
But that's the thing too, is they say, use less coal, ride your bike. What about, eat less meat?
Yeah. I think they focus grouped it and it's a political loser. In terms of, because they're membership organizations, a lot of them. They're looking to maximize the number of people making contributions, and if they get identified as being anti-meat or challenging people on their everyday habits, that's something that's so dear to people that it will hurt with their fundraising.
They do not want to address the primary driving cause of environmental devastation, which is animal agriculture, because they're businesses and they want to make sure that they have a reliable source of funding.
You listen to the majority of the major environmental organizations, they're not telling you to do much besides live your life the way you've been living it, but change your light bulb from time to time, drive less, use less plastic, recycle more. It's better for their fundraising and better for their profile to create a victim and perpetrator sort of plot line.
It's like When we talk about the fact that when we have a dysfunctional family and the father is an alcoholic, that's the one thing no one talks about. Everybody goes around that, and yet it's the one thing that's causing the devastation in the relationships in the family, because no one wants to talk about it.
How could these organizations not know? I mean, the issue is right in front of them. It's unmistakable at this point. And just like these organizations, they're falling over themselves to show the general public that climate change is human-caused. And in doing so, they completely fail to see what's right in front of them, that animal agriculture, raising and killing animals for food, is really what's killing the planet.
Well, it's basically burning too many fossil fuels. So coal, natural gas, oil, tar sands, oil shale, all these new exotic fuels that are kind of hybrids between them. But that's basically what is loading up the atmosphere. So we have this greenhouse effect where the heat is getting trapped and the temperatures are soaring at a rate that has never existed in the history of the Earth.
And what about livestock and animal agriculture?
Well, what about it? I mean,
we do just research. A couple of the UN report says it's more. Livestock accounts for more than all transportation put together. A recent 2009 World Watch report, livestock causes 51% of all greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, well, it is a big issue, and we need to address that as well. But, there's just so many different potential sources of methane and carbon emissions.
If the number one leading cause is animal agriculture and meat consumption, then doesn't that need to be the number one focus, if not the number two?
Well, that's your assessment. Our assessment is different.
Thanks again, and we wish you the best of luck. Greenpeace's response reminded me of the statistic that 116,000 pounds of farm animal excrement is produced every second in the United States alone. That is enough waste per year to cover every square foot of San Francisco, New York City, Tokyo, Paris, New Delhi, Berlin, Hong Kong, London, Rio de Janeiro, Delaware, Bali, Costa Rica, and Denmark combined.
Livestock operations on land has caused created more than 500 nitrogen-flooded dead zones around the world in our oceans, comprise more than 95,000 square miles of areas completely devoid of life. So any meaningful discussion about the state of our oceans has to always begin by frank discussions about land-based animal agriculture, which is not what our conservation groups, Oceana being the largest one in the world right now, the most influential, as well as others, that's not what is at the apex of their discussion.
The UN reported that 3/4 of the world's fisheries are overexploited, fully exploited, or significantly depleted due to overfishing.
The oceans are under siege like never before, and marine environments are in trouble. And if we don't wake up and do something about it, we're going to see fishless oceans by the year 2048. That's the prediction from scientists.
The oceans are in complete collapse. The large fish species are nearing extinction.
The way fishing is done today to feed the demand for 90 million tons of fish is primarily through massive fish nets. For every single pound of fish caught, there's up to 5 pounds of untargeted species trapped, such as dolphins, whales, sea turtles, and sharks, known as bykill. If we were to imagine this same sort of practice happening on the African savanna, targeting gazelle, but in the process scooping up every single lion, giraffe, ostrich, and elephant, nobody would stand for it. Yet, this is what is happening in our oceans every single day.
Between 40 and 50 million sharks each year are killed in fishing lines and fishing nets as bykill. Then their fins might be cut off or not cut off, but they're caught initially as bykill, and it's from fishing. It's from fishing in a sustainable manner, in many cases, for fish that are labeled sustainable by, for instance, Oceana and these sustainable certified organizations. So my thought is that why would we want to stop at banning shark fin soup if you're concerned about sharks, which all these organizations are, and most of the public at large is now. If we really are concerned about sharks, we would ban fishing.
Our founder, Captain Watson, likes to say, if the oceans die, we die. That's not a tagline. That's the truth.
Perhaps the only other ecosystem that is being destroyed at such a rapid rate are the world's rainforests. Our global rainforests are essentially the planet's lungs. They breathe in CO2 and exhale oxygen. An acre of rainforest is cleared every second, and the leading cause is to graze animals and grow their feed crops. That is essentially an entire football field cleared every single second. And it is estimated that every day, close to 100 plant, animal, and insect species are lost due to rainforest destruction.
This is really what's going on. Why do you think that's like no Greenpeace or no one's really saying the whole story?
The whole story about one of the main cause of deforestation.
Yeah.
And I think you brought up some really good points about why isn't anybody doing anything about this? And I think in Brazil in particular, I think when we look at what happened after the forest code was passed, and people who were standing up against the lobbyists and the interests, the special interests, the cattle industry, the agribusiness industry, what was happening to them? A lot of people who were speaking out got killed. And if you look at, say Carlos, you look at Claudio, there's people who are putting themselves out there and saying, cattle ranching, is destroying the Amazon. A lot of those people who are really putting themselves out there, and look at Dorothy Stang, the nun who lived out in Pará, who was killed. A lot of people will speak up. A lot of people just keep their mouths shut because they don't want to be the next one with the bullet to their head.
Sister Dorothy Stang was a U.S.-born nun living in the heart of the Brazilian rainforest. Her life's work was to protect the Amazon. She spoke out openly against the destruction of rainforests from cattle ranching for years. Walking home one night, she was brutally gunned down at point-blank range by a hired gun from the cattle industry. Currently, nearly half of all United States land is already dedicated to animal agriculture. If we were to switch over to grass-fed beef, it would require clearing every square inch of the United States, up into Canada, all of Central America, and well into South America. And this is just to feed the United States' demand on meat. But that figure doesn't even take into consideration that much of that land isn't suited to graze livestock. We would have to convert all mountain ranges to grassland, clear ancient forests and national parks to grazing, and demolish every city just to make room to graze cows. Just like Brazil, the United States isn't suited to meet the demands for meat. Almost a third of the planet's land is becoming desert, with a vast majority due to livestock grazing. Savory claims that the best way to reverse this desertification is to actually graze more animals. This reminded me of Oceana saying the best way to help fish is to eat fish. This is the same man, during the 1950s, working as a research officer for the game department of what is now Zimbabwe, came up with a theory, in spite of scientific evidence, that actually elephants were the cause of desertification there. And his solution was convincing the government to kill 40,000 elephants. Yet, after 14 years of relentless slaughter, the conditions only got worse. His theory was wrong. The culling finally ended, but not until tens of thousands of elephants and their families were killed. This is not someone I would ever take ecological advice from. It turns out the cattle industry is having the same effect on wildlife in the United States.
The government has been rounding up horses en masse, and we now have more wild horses and burros in government holding facilities, 50,000 wild horses and burros in government holding facilities than we have free on the range. Basically, you have ranchers who get to graze on our public lands for a fraction of the going rate. So they're getting like this huge tax subsidy. It's about 1/15 of the going rate. And what the Bureau of Land Management has to do is say how much forage and water is on the land, and then they divvy it up. They give so much to the cows, so much to, wildlife, and so much to the wild horses and burros. And what we see is the lion's share of the forage and water is going to the livestock industry. And then they scapegoat the horses and burros and say, oh, there are too many horses and burros, let's remove them. I always tell people that wild horses and burros are just one of the victims of the management of our public lands for livestock, because we also see the predator killing going on. We know wolves are now being targeted by ranchers to get rid of wolves. USDA has aircraft, and all they do is aerial gunning of predators. So all a rancher does is call up and say, I've got a coyote here. They'll come over and they'll shoot the coyote, or they'll shoot the mountain lion, or they'll shoot the bobcat. And this is all for ranching.
In Washington State, after cattle were found to be attacked on public lands where they were grazing under permit, Washington State decided to kill the entire wedge pack of wolves. And those wolves were not introduced. They had in-migrated from Canada, but they're no longer there.
It starts at the local level with the Bureau of Land Management, but then it goes all the way to Congress. And we see Congress, sitting there willing to allow this type of mismanagement of our public lands to continue.
It is the insistence of and the lobbying power of the animal agriculture industry that continues to see wolves killed, continues to see an insistence that predators be maintained at a low level that does not benefit ecosystems.
I've seen so many pieces of land, I've looked at so many environmental assessments from the Bureau of Land Management where they say the rangelands are not meeting standards. And they say straight up, livestock grazing is a cause for not meeting range standards, and yet they will continue to allow livestock grazing.
They're at the very core of making sure that cougars are treed by hounds and that wolf packs are run down and that hunting seasons are opened up year-round and that traps are set so that they can suffer.
If anyone cares about wild horses and wildlife and public lands and the environment, you can't ignore the livestock, the impact, the negative impact that livestock grazing is having on our public lands in the West.
I've added up the costs of animal food production that the producers don't actually bear themselves. These are the hidden costs or the externalized costs that they impose on society. And those are in categories like healthcare, environmental damage, subsidies, damage to fisheries, and even cruelty. If you take those externalized costs, which are about $414 billion, if the meat and dairy industries were required to internalize those costs, if they had to bear those costs themselves, the costs of the retail prices of meat and dairy would skyrocket. So a $5 carton of eggs would go to $13. A $4 Big Mac would go to $11. The problem with these externalized costs being imposed on society is that whether you eat meat or not, whether you're an omnivore or an herbivore, you are paying part of the costs of somebody else's consumption. So that when somebody goes into a McDonald's and buys a Big Mac for $4, there's another $7 of costs that's imposed on society. I'm paying that. You're paying that, whether you eat meat or not.
In 1812, there were 1 billion people on the planet. In 1912, there were 1.5 billion. Then, just 100 years later, our population exploded to 7 billion humans. This number is rightly given a great deal of attention, but an even more important figure when determining world population is the world's 70 billion farm animals humans raise.
We're growing enough food right now in the world to feed between 12 and 15 billion people. We only have 7 billion people. We have roughly 1 billion people starving every single day. Worldwide, 50% of the grain and legumes that we're growing, we're feeding to animals. So they're eating huge amounts of grain and legumes. And in the United States, it's more like closer to 70, 80, depending on which grain it is, about 90% of the soybean.
82% of the world's starving children live in countries where food is fed to animals in the livestock systems that are then killed and eaten by more well-off individuals in developed countries such as the U.S., UK, and in Europe.
The fact of it is that we could feed every human being on the planet today an adequate diet if we did no more than take the feed that we are feeding to animals and actually turn it into food for humans.